Welcome to week 9 of international trade. In this week, we will be discussing another aspect of international trade, which is international monetary systems. The textbook chapter is chapter 19, and you can also refer to Core Econ's capstone number 18. The international monetary systems is a set of rules and regulations that enable countries to trade with other countries, and it includes the exchange rate market. The chapter in our prescribed textbook is chapter 19, which gives us an historical overview of the developments in the international monetary system. For this week, our outline will be to briefly introduce international monetary systems. We will discuss the macroeconomic policy goals in an open economy, which frames the international monetary system and how it impacts the economy. We will then classify various monetary systems that have existed in the world and its developments. Our chapter concludes with international macroeconomic policy. One aspect that is crucial to world trade is the exchange rate. In both first and second year macroeconomics, you were introduced to how exchange rates are determined and how this impacts trade. If you need to, remind yourself of these. While we will not cover all the technical details of the theory in this course, you are welcome to read through chapters 13 to 18 of the textbook for more detail. You will also be covering more of this in third year macroeconomics. In this chapter, however, we will continue our historical discussion of last week by looking at the development of international monetary systems. This chapter covers four eras in the international monetary system development. The gold standard era that ranged from the late 19th century until the 1930s. We will also look at the period between the two world wars, referred to as the interwar period, in which the gold standard disintegrated while some countries returned to the gold standard. The Bretton Woods system followed that after the Second World War and reigned until 1973, and this was followed by the current regime of floating exchange rates. While we discuss these eras, there are two aspects of macroeconomics that should be kept in mind: internal versus external balance. Before we start our discussion of the eras, we will define what is meant by each of these. There are 3 learning outcomes for this week. First, as you know, you will be writing more this term than in the first term. After this chapter, you should be able to describe the goals of internal and external balance of macroeconomics. Second, you should understand and apply the macroeconomic trilemma that policymakers face and compare the experience of countries with this trilemma. Third, you should be able to review and compare the various eras of development in the international monetary system with regard to internal and external balance, as well as within the framework of the trilemma. The 2 main macroeconomic goals in an open economy are, first, the internal balance of the economy. As it suggests, the internal balance refers to the domestic macroeconomic goals and relates to the full employment of the country's resources and a stable domestic price level. Second, the external balance of the economy refers to the country's current account. Do you remember what the current account means? If not, refer back to your first year macroeconomic chapter 5. On the current account, you do not want a large surplus or a large deficit. Just a reminder of where you could find statistics on South Africa. The GDP figures, unemployment figures, and inflation rate are released by Stats SA. The current account data is released by the Reserve Bank in the quarterly bulletin. Before we discuss the macroeconomic trilemma, let us look at the internal balance in more detail. The 2 main goals of the internal balance is full employment of the country's resources and price level stability. A country therefore achieves internal stability when the resources are fully employed and the price level is stable. Remember that the price level does not mean that there is no inflation, but rather a low and predictable inflation rate. Most of the terms were also covered in your first year macroeconomic course. In this chapter, you will see sometimes there's reference to an overheated economy. An overheated economy occurs when the resources are overemployed. For examples, workers are expected to work overtime and take less time for leisure. You can also overemploy various categories of unemployment as well. For example, overworked seasonal unemployment. Underemployment, on the other hand, reduces efficiency and can reduce the real value of the monetary unit, the currency of your country. Both inflation and deflation is possible under conditions of full employment. Finally, rather than no inflation, predictable inflation is more important. While there is no such thing as a truly predictable inflation rate, but when movements become unpredictable, the changes in the price level are magnified. Think of hyperinflation cases like Argentina, Brazil, or Zimbabwe. When this happens, the currency stops functioning as units of account or stores of value. Again, refer back to your macroeconomic first year for the functions of money, and in your second year macroeconomics for the discussion of the magnification of price level changes. This is also why the Reserve Bank does not have a point estimate of the price level, but rather aims for an inflation rate between 3 and 6%. External balance refers to an optimal level of the current account. This is more difficult to define than full employment of resources and the price level. The reason for this difficulty in definition is that the external balance depends not only on the country's ability to produce for the world market, but also depends on the external conditions in other countries. The institutional arrangements, like the World Trade Organization's rules, also impact a country's current account. The goal of external balance might differ between countries depending on their exchange rate, and might differ if it has a fixed exchange rate or a floating exchange rate. Similarly to the goal of price level stability, the goal of external balance does not mean equilibrium on the current account or no trade taking place, but rather just to avoid large surpluses or deficits. Problems with excessive current account deficits includes the question of what is the purpose of borrowing. Was the borrowing for productive investment or high consumption? Productive investments generally tend to repay for themselves when completed, while consumption does not, as it is once-off use of borrowing. There might also be problems with policy or malfunctions in the economy, like market structure problems. There is also intertemporal budget constraint that limits the spending of governments over time. The final problem with large deficits on the current account is that if governments cannot repay debts made to foreign investors, it might lead to foreign governments refusing to lend them more funds to the country, and this could lead to a sudden stop, where the country is unable to import necessities like fuel or food. Problems with large current account surplus include that the government accumulates assets abroad rather than domestically. When there is a large current account surplus, domestic investment in plants and equipment is lowered for a given level of savings. This leads to the breakdown of domestic capital. A large current account surplus might also mean that the government is not able to collect debts from other governments. A large current account surplus also becomes a political pawn, of which China and Japan are key examples. A large current account surplus can become targets for import tariffs like Japan had in the past and that China is currently facing with the United States. To share an anecdote with you from my master's year, which was during the Great Recession, our macroeconomics professor asked who is to blame for the deficit of the United States. A friend of mine replied that if you ask an American, they would say China, and if you ask a Chinese, they would say the American. It becomes a question of perception. Next, we need to discuss the Open-Economy Trilemma. The trilemma refers to a country facing a decision between two of three choices. First, exchange rate stability. Second is independent monetary policy or monetary policy orientated towards domestic goals. And finally, the freedom of international capital movements either through import quotas or tariffs. This figure represents this choice between the various choices. Let's start at the bottom of the triangle. If a country decides to have independent monetary policy or monetary policy autonomy and the freedom of financial and capital flows, that is, you can import capital goods or you can import financial stocks, it cannot pick the exchange rate, so it cannot pick exchange rate stability. Therefore, it must have a floating exchange rate. This is currently the choice of South Africa. Second, the left side of the triangle. If a country decides to pick independent monetary policy and exchange rate stability, it must have financial controls and cannot have freedom of financial goods or capital goods. Third, the right side of the triangle is when a country chooses to have an exchange rate stability and the freedom of financial and capital flows. In this case, it must have an exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate. China chose this option during its opening phase to the world economy from the 1980s, when it pegged to the dollar, but it has since also moved to a floating exchange rate regime. I will stop here for this video and continue with slide 12 in the next video.